a harm reduction organization serving youth drug users. He founded OcuCards in 2011, a collective that makes 4 by 6 info cards exposing the criminal collusion between corporations and government. Ladies and gentlemen, Emanuel Sferios.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I particularly want to thank Bobby for inviting me, um, uh, believing I had credentials. He sort of introduced, things I've done in the past. So I'll just get right into it since I only have 15 minutes. Actually, Bobby and I went back and forth for quite a while on what the title of the talk would be and decided on some generic thing like building bridges. But really, I wanted to kind of, in this short amount of time, say uh, really kind of the state of politics today. And of course, by that, I don't mean electoral politics. I mean, activism and social change, the prospects for real, revolutionary radical politics, sort of where we stand today, and then two, what I feel are the most important things to know when you're organizing that I've learned over the years, and then my sort of the philosophy that I use for organizing. So state of affairs, two important principles, and then my philosophy. So here we go. I think the state of affairs today is really interesting when you look at the history of organizing. It has a lot to do with mass media and propaganda and the sort of control that the corporate state has. If you're my age, you might remember the pre-internet days and how difficult it was to find information because we were just clearly, if you were smart, you knew you were being spoon-fed propaganda everywhere. All you had was sort of television and the big magazines, or you could search out if you were in big cities political zines, right, and get some kind of different perspective. But you were such a minority. Then this thing happened called the internet, which kind of democratized mass media, right? And it held such promise. And I really want to point out the failure of that promise. Promise of the internet failed. I call it from the Zapatista uprising to CNN dominance. In '94, the Zapatistas were the first organization that utilized the internet to galvanize the world. And many people believe that they actually stopped an invasion back in that year because so many people knew of what was going on through the internet. And it was like now suddenly, with search engines and the way it worked, people who were interested can find you. You didn't have to compile a mailing list of millions. You could compete with the corporate entities and get your message out. But if you look at what's happened since then, um, it is easy to find information uh, now, much easier, or incredibly easier than it was back then. But still, the most visited websites are the corporate news sites, CNN, et cetera. So what's going on there? I think we have to understand that in general, people are conformists. I call it like the water cooler effect. People don't want to talk about controversial stuff in general. They would rather be a part of their culture and kind of know what's up with the water cooler conversations that are going on. And so they're going to, why would they go to an activist website to learn about some obscure stuff happening in this part of the world or these little movements or whatever? They still choose, the majority of people, they still choose to go to the corporate state to get their information. And uh, the other thing about this propaganda is it's not just that people are going, right, and getting one side. They're choosing a team. And this has to do with human nature. And people like to have different, they like a dialectic. And the way that propaganda works in our corporate state today is they give us two sides, right? You have the liberals, conservative. This is how, right, the Republicrats operate. There's my OccuCard. There we go. Strange. There's a delay here. Sorry. Anyway, you know, Fox News versus NBC kind of, you know, frames the two sides, and you can pick which side and root on for your team, right? Um, we need to understand this aspect of people if we want to know how we're going to affect change today. How do we frame our message to influence people? And we have to use the same techniques that the corporate class uses. In fact, they're pretty scientific behaviorist psychology traits. Most important one is framing the debate. They frame the debate in such a way where both sides end up leading to the result that they want. I got to remember, propaganda wasn't designed for smart people. It was designed to provide people that want to just conform to their society with a reason to stop thinking any farther. So how do we frame the debate? How do you control the dialectic? You need to understand that when you present something, and make sure you're not. Too often we just want to sort of hammer our point across, and we don't realize that we may be appealing to our allies, but we're hardening our adversaries at the same time. And we're not going to affect the kind of change we want if we play right into this kind of dialectic, because this sort of butt heads battle with those we consider our enemies. Because if we do, we just harden that other side. We'll have temporary gains, right? But then there'll be a backlash eventually. Real change has to come from moving that Hegelian dialectic forward with a synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And so we need to frame the debate so it ends up providing a synthesis that we want. And that means sort of reaching out in some ways and meeting our adversaries halfway to sort of bring them along. And this gets into my personal philosophy of organizing that I've always used, and I think it's been very successful. It's a two-pronged approach. The first is simply rally your allies before trying to convert your adversaries. That's sort of key, number one, right? You have to provide, there's so many people out there that support social change, progressive radical people who understand the criminal collusion between corporations and government that is going on right now, and they want change. And you have to rally them first. But like I'm pointing out, just rallying them with your own rhetoric isn't enough. You have to use part two of this approach also, which is provide your allies with the tools and resources, including arguments, that they can use to convert their adversaries. And if you do both these things, you have a successful strategy. So, for example, with Occu cards, if you don't know what Occu cards are, I started them. There's 25 info cards for the Occupy movement. I wanted to support the Occupy movement by giving all of the encampments out there literature that they could use to hand out to people. And it's got a nice graphic on one side, and on the other side is a 450-word essay. And in the essay, I tried to be, I used this strategy to try to present grassroots civil disobedience, mass organizing, the kind of strategy Occupy was using, in a way that made it palatable to the mainstream. And I think it's been successful. I haven't put out any new cards in over a year, but we sold online over 1 million cards. And it was the approach of meeting our adversaries halfway. You're in an Occupy encampment, you're handing out a card to a passerby, and you don't want it to just say rah rah smash the state, right? You wanted to explain the issue and in a way say, here's why you should join us. And so meeting your adversaries halfway and bringing them along is a very crucial um, way to do this. I'm using the same strategy with my upcoming documentary. I'm making a drug war documentary. It's going to center around the drug MDMA, or ecstasy Molly. But I could very easily produce a film that just embarrassed, the opposition, the drug warriors, and made them look really bad. There's been some documentaries that do that. I could use the Michael Moore approach, in other words. But Michael Moore films were very, very popular, but they have not led to the kind of change that he's seeking. And I think because as much as he rallies every, kind of progressive person on the one side, he also really galvanizes the opposition and on the other, and they've not changed their minds. And if they haven't changed their minds, then we're going to be playing this battle forever. And the idea is, remember, to synthesize and move to the next level of the dialectic. There's always going to be conflict, but we can at least manage the current conflicts and move them to a better place. So I plan to reflect the drug war sentiments in the most respectful way that I can, by showing the solutions to them rather than embarrassing my opposition. So that's my personal strategy with activism, and I feel that has been a very successful one. I encourage you to use that. It's not so much I'm saying tone down your rhetoric and don't be radical, right? It's actually more like be more radical by understanding how people's minds work and how we can utilize the media that we do have. Because even though, I opened this with saying the internet failed, we do live in a very interesting society. We live in this kind of open liberal empire that gives us the opportunity to affect change still. Maybe we should be grateful to the masters that rule our society for letting us do this. I remember I set up an OccuCards table at Glenn Greenwald event. This was before Snowden. It was in Davis, University of Davis. And I had a bunch of OccuCards there, and this Asian woman comes up and she was like, "Oh, what's this? Oh, wow. Oh my gosh, look at this. And this is amazing." And I started telling her about the corporate state and blah, blah, blah. And she was clicking through this. Turns out she was an exchange student from China. And her first and only response was, "You couldn't do this in my country. You couldn't do this in my country." So we do have opportunities here to make progressive change that they don't in China, because they use a more physical force approach to stifling dissent, rather than the kind of manipulative propaganda, present the two sides approach and get people brainwashed that they do in this country. It gives us the opportunity to use some of those techniques to do that. Looks like I got 1 minute left, and I kind of, my order here is, I jumped ahead to my philosophy without talking about the two sort of principles I wanted to get out. One, I talked about frame the debate, but number two, and this is very important, give people something to do when you're organizing. And I'll talk about Food Not Bombs, and then Dance Safe, another organization I founded. Other than OccuCards, I worked for Food Not Bombs for 4 or 5 years when I was in my late teens and early 20s. I sort of got my activist education in Berkeley working for Food Not Bombs. And what I realized then is, if you wanted to start a homeless advocacy organization and just sort of advocate for the homeless, which Food Not Bombs does, go out on the street, hand out literature, speak in front of the city council like I did so many times, you could do that, but you're not going to get many people to join you. If, however, you provide a direct service, people will flock to you, and your advocacy work will have so much power. So Food Not Bombs was not only a homeless advocacy organization, they also fed the homeless. Of course, they fed themselves. They were of, by, and for homeless people and everyone, right? So this is actually why, when I discovered that there were ecstasy testing kits in existence, and that the Dutch government was actually using them to help ecstasy users avoid the fake pills on the illicit market that were killing people, I realized the organizing potential that I had. I'd already been a drug policy reform activist. I'd done needle exchange. Again, that's a good service, right? So I said, here I can now organize ravers, ecstasy users, electronic music enthusiasts, etc., because there is a tool, a service I can provide. So DanceSafe was set up not just to advocate to end the drug war um, and replace zero tolerance with harm reduction approaches, because if I just did that, I wouldn't have gotten anywhere, right? But the fact that I had a tool and a service, there were 24 chapters within a year that we had across the country. So in your organizing, if you can find a service to provide people that you do parallel with your advocacy work, you will have great success that way, because people love to help each other. That sort of transcends the propaganda. You know, you can change culture on the ground by creating new institutions of cooperation, of people supporting each other. So think about a service. I guess my time's up. So hope you enjoyed it and learned a little something. I guess we're doing Q&A.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel Sferios. We appreciate you coming on to AdCon 3, and glad that you were here to present your fantastic talk, and want to get into some questions for you as well. You know, you have been an activist a long time, and in activism, we find that staying power for activists is hard, even short term. And I wanted you to address, first of all, what has kept you from burning out? And second, how would you discuss that to help organizations and activists from not burning out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think part of why I haven't burnt out is that I got involved in drug policy reform, where we're actually seeing progress. I think we're seeing progress in gay rights and drug policy reform, but not much else. You know, I when you're involved in something you're making some victories, you can avoid burning out. I think a lot of other reasons that people burn out, and we need to look hard at this, has to do with sort of the dark side or the ugly nature of activist groups and activists in general. We as activists tend to be quite righteous people, and if you've been an activist, you realize sort of like what we're trying to do to build a movement is make other people into activists, and that can lead to, like, you know, a lot of resentment that you know, you're not doing enough, and we criticize each other, and this sort of righteousness, I think, turns a lot of people off, turns a lot of people away. So we need to take care of one another in these movements. We need to forgive. We need to have, you know, soften our own edges, even as our strategy is very confrontational. I believe in nonviolent, direct action, confrontational, nonviolent, disruptive actions like civil disobedience, etc. But amongst ourselves, we need to, I believe, soften our edges. And I think the corporate state infiltrates and disrupts us largely by driving those wedges in, by making us fight more, by using this more radical than thou sort of you know, righteousness to turn us against each other. Like I remember this is a big lesson during the second anniversary of the the first anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. I was in Seattle organizing, and there was the Not in Our Name and International Answer were the two groups that were the main groups in the coalition, and then about a bunch of other groups or whatever. And a couple of weeks before the march and the first anniversary, there was a split between the two organizations. Not in Our Name thought that we should be end the occupation of Iraq and Palestine, and they wanted to link the Israeli occupation of Palestine and to the flyers and the whole march. And the International Answer didn't want to do that. Let's just focus on just the Iraq War. and they would not compromise with each other. It got really ugly, including accusing people of being racist and Israeli sympathizers and the whole bit. And eventually it split, and there were two marches, and this sort of began the fizzle of the anti-war movement. Like the before the war, were the largest protests ever in this country, and on the first anniversary, it kind of broke up. Well, what I learned is that this exact thing didn't just play out in Seattle. It played out in Dallas, New York, San Francisco. Basically, every city in the country had this exact same hostility break out 2 weeks before the meeting, and everyone got discouraged and burnt out, and the resistance to the wars and the occupation kind of fizzled. And you have to wonder whether there was infiltration and disruption going on when that happens. Very, very hard to protect ourselves from that kind of disruption. But the kind of righteousness and, not in our name was like, we're more radical than you because we know, they wanted to include the Palestine occupation in the flyer. Like no willingness to compromise. So hope that answers your question. Avoiding burning out. Hello? I can't hear anyone.
It does, and we have a question from our chat room. I apologize that you couldn't hear me. One of our chat room members, Fija, which is the Jury Nullification Organization, asked this question: any thoughts on how to deal with disruptors, people harassing or threatening other activists within the group? Often I see people wanting to gloss over this and as if both sides are equal and should quit infighting. But I feel that sort of gives some tact to permission to the abusers, yet focusing on the disruption also diverts attention from the issue. Just to address that, you have about 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's a really, really hard one. There's very clear behaviors I think we can call out and not tolerate abusive behaviors, physical violence, verbal insults, things like that, talking over even, not hugely egregious, but you can have internal, policies, processes that can avoid some of this. But a lot of it is very difficult. I know the Black Panthers put out a how to protect yourself against COINTELPRO manual that I think is still very apropos today. Things like the whole snitch jacketing, accusing someone of being an agent, right? Don't do that without evidence. And when you find any evidence, do it immediately and publicly. Because just snitch jacketing itself, calling someone an agent, an infiltrator, a disruptor, is disruptive. That's a tactic they use to put snitch jackets on key activists to make, crazy make within the organization. So it's a great question. I wish I could say I knew the answer to it. I know I have left groups because of it. So, I wasn't able to stomach and solve the problem myself, and that's exactly what they want. So, should I be embarrassed about that? What happened in Occupy was very disheartening. It was very clear that they infiltrated and disrupted us everywhere. So read that Black Panther manual. I'm sure you can find online. And stick to your principles. Don't let your emotions get the best of you. And good luck. It's a hard one.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. I appreciate it. We appreciate you coming on here to ActCon 3. We hope everybody enjoyed your conversation. I'm glad you decided to stop by, and I always look forward to working with you in the future, as does the Solution Institute. You be well, and I'm sure we'll see you out there, boots on the ground.
Thanks, Bobby. Keep up the great work.
Thank you.